keep our hope going in what seems to be a very difficult situation. But before we get there, I always like to start my presentations reminding people about the beginning of the full-scale invasion into Ukraine. For those of you who might remember, the war actually began in 2014 when Russian proxies came into the eastern parts of Ukraine and took over and annexed Crimea. And from that time on, it was like a simmering conflict. There was a contact line that was going on. You can see it with the dotted line on the maps here. And then, and there was a lot of peace talks that were going on, trying to bring an end to the conflict. But on February 24th, 2022, the Russian military started a full-scale invasion into Ukraine by land, sea, and air. There were about 100 ballistic missiles that were launched at one time. Russian troops, boots on the ground, entered Ukraine from the north, the east, and the south. And again, this was an escalation of the war, which actually had begun in 2014. Here you see some of the initial pictures of what was happening then in the country. This is the outskirts of the capital city of Kyiv. You can see where all the smoke is going, where the missile strikes happened. You can see that they were striking civilian areas indiscriminately, bombing and taking over different parts. At that time, in the very beginning, there was 21.3 million Ukrainians who were affected by what was happening. There was a huge mass exodus of people crossing the country. Yeah, so there was people who were obviously in kind of more frontline areas or in areas that became occupied. But then you had about 14 million people cross the country over the course of that first year, either resettling in central or western parts of the country or fleeing further to go abroad. So that's just huge numbers. It was more than half the population that was being severely affected. This is a picture of a bridge that was close to the capital city again, and the Russians were approaching and taking over certain outskirts suburbs of the city of Kyiv, and these were people fleeing from those suburban areas into the city, and then to flee further on to the western part of the country. So that's a picture of what happened. And then here, I thought this would be an interesting map for us to look at. You see here that there are the yellow areas are the areas that are have always just been under Ukrainian control. You see the kind of green areas. Those are areas that the Russians had advanced into and then retreated from. Yeah, they were pushed back by the Ukrainian forces. If you see like the darker pink area, that's the area that's currently occupied by the Russian forces. And then you see, I don't know if you can see it up here, kind of in the top right corner, there's the area of the Kursk Oblast where the Ukrainian forces have pushed across the border, trying to deflect some of the activities that are going on here in the east. So that kind of gives you a picture of where we are. Most of the retreats that happened, this was in 2022. Yeah, in 2023 there really wasn't much movement on the front line areas, and then in 2024, you're aware I just presented the Kursk, and then the Russians are making, I don't know if you can see, but they're making headway here in the very east part of the country on the ground forces. So some current statistics of what's happening, because it doesn't get into the news. There has been a huge intensification of bombing happening all over the country. There's kind of two main pieces, I think, they're affecting this. One is the introduction of new bombs. It's these guided aerial bombs that can be shot out, and then they can travel further, and they're able to get to highly populated cities that they weren't able to reach before they had these additional piece that helps to guide the aerial bomb further. that's one piece that's starting to change the picture. The other one is the use of the drones as bombs. So in September alone, there was over 1,000 drone attacks. It's a record high since autumn of 2022. Of them, probably a little bit over 250 reached their final target. The other ones were intercepted. But if you don't know, the problem with the interception is that anyway, the debris has to fall somewhere. Yeah, and so you still have damages that come from interceptions as well. In addition, from the very beginning, they've been working on the destruction of the energy infrastructure in Ukraine. At this point, about 60% of the 2022 energy infrastructure is already destroyed. They've destroyed over 2 million homes, and then also in addition, schools and hospitals have been targeted. Currently, the number of people in need for 2024 is 14.6 million people. That's about 40% of the population. The number of the currently displaced people is about 4 million. And of course, now there's a new wave of displacement happening in the east because of the Russian offensive in the eastern parts of the country. You'll see in a minute, but I just want to mention that this new wave of displacement, it's more vulnerable people. So with every in the beginning, when it first started, the first people who are fleeing are people who have cars, who have a capacity to travel and move around. And then with time, you get more and more vulnerable people coming through. So with this last attacks on the east, it's really the people who never displaced, they stayed behind. It's usually people who were very attached to their homes. They might have had farms. They might have been also have somebody who's elderly who can't travel well, or somebody with special needs. So these are really very vulnerable people who are being displaced in this new wave. This is here. Well, actually, I should have shown you the picture immediately. So you see this is a picture of from the new wave of displacement. You also see here's an attack in Zaporizhzhia on the dam. This was an energy infrastructure attack. It also affected the logistics of the city because the dam had a bridge crosses from one side of the city to the other. Here on this picture, you see drones flying, and then at the bottom, just general destruction. A little bit about displacement. So this is a 2024 map, so it'll be different. It'll look different in 2025, but this is from 2024. So you can see that most people are staying close to their homes, as close as they can, or they're going into regions where they can find jobs. So you see there's a high level of displacement here in Lvivsko Oblast because there's a large city there and it's better to find jobs. Obviously in Kyiv and the Kyiv Oblast, it's a huge amount of displacement. And then Poltava, simply because it's close, Kharkivska, Dnipropetrovska, Mykolaiska, and Odessa Oblast. What I also want to point out is that there isn't a single place in Ukraine that doesn't have people who are displaced. So the needs of displacement are present everywhere, just in some places they're a little more intense because the numbers are so high. And what are the consequences? So when people are displaced, if you've lost everything, you've lost your home, probably you've left with almost nothing or maybe just a little suitcase. There's usually a need for basic needs, shelter, food, hygiene products, water. There's a need for psychosocial support and social integration wherever you end up. There's also an increased pressure on the civil societies, the societal system. So on the medical system, educational system, social services, because you have this huge influx of people. And of course, there's a need for employment. Yeah, a lot of the people who were displaced, were either working somewhere, or they had successful little businesses, and they've lost everything, including their homes, all their livelihood. And so there's a great need to help people to re-engage. Here's just some information about the educational facilities. I thought it would be interesting for you that there's over 3,000 educational facilities were damaged or destroyed. That's, direct hits of missiles or drones or rockets into the facilities. And then there's a particular situation that's happening with children. So out of the 3 million children in Ukraine, only about one third are able to attend school on a regular basis. Another third are online completely, and another third are in a hybrid situation. So you have situations sometimes, so you can't have the school operating if you don't have a shelter. So some of the schools don't have shelters that are big enough, and so they have to take turns. The children take turns going to classes or having it online. So you can imagine that this is, after the 2 years of COVID, and then now we're coming close to 2.5 years of the war, of the full-scale invasion. Okay, so that kind of is setting the picture. What I wanted to talk to you more about was the humanitarian response. And one of the things that really struck me in the beginning of all of this was kind of the nobility that stands, there's a nobleness that stands behind humanitarian response for a lot of different reasons. First of all, because it's mostly based on solidarity, yeah? It's always someone helping somebody else, and there's a solidarity involved. There's also, there's a way of approaching it, and I think that Caritas and CRS and different Catholic relief organizations have a kind of a particular way of approaching this. Is this ability to see the human person, yeah, to see the human person in their totality and the complexity of their needs. And as a community, we're able to provide a very particular response where we can kind of embrace people into a community rather than just giving them the material needs that they need. There's a kind of a deeper embrace that happens through the Caritas organizations. There's some pictures from our different services that we do. So, and what is it that I mentioned in the beginning that I wanted to talk more about building resilience, charity, and hope. Yeah. And, I already started talking a little bit about what it means to be inside of a Catholic relief organization. And I think one of the things that's really powerful for people is this engagement into the mission. Yeah. When there's a crisis going on, it really is helpful to be able to come out of yourself, yeah? Come out of yourself and join into something bigger, join into something constructive, into a mission. And Caritas exactly provides that for people. It's also, Caritas has this beautiful, it's called spirituality of encounter, yeah? And this, that we're called to be gift to one another. We're called to, again, part of what we're created as human beings is we're created for relationship, and that in this act of providing humanitarian aid and this act of helping our neighbor in need, you're kind of living this amazing essence of what it means to be human by being in relationship. You're also restoring a sense of relationship for people who have experienced trauma. Yeah, so somebody who's experienced brutality of war, their homes destroyed, or occupation, and any other list of other kinds of brutality that come with that, to be able to encounter somebody who's offering the opposite of it and helping to restore that piece of humanity, that understanding of relationship, of how we're all dependent on one another and we need one another, and that we're called to be together. It's a really powerful experience. And I've seen it, I'll show you a little bit later. I've seen that over and over in our volunteers, and many of them, probably about, at this point, it's about between 35 and 40% of the volunteers that we have is people who've come to us for aid and then come back and say that they want to be part of this encounter, part of this helping other people. And that gets to my third point, which is being part of a community. Yeah. So again, all of this is kind of restoring that sense of what it means to be human, to be in relationship, to be in community, and to be going outside of yourself and helping someone else. It's a really powerful experience. And it's one of the things that I see, when I travel around, I visit our local Caritas. I'm always really inspired by them, by meeting the beneficiaries, by meeting the staff. You have a real sense of like this pulsating life, like an abundance of life, like in the middle of a war, and yet you have people who are filled, filled with some kind of sense of purpose and mission. It's a really powerful experience. It's like theology in front of you, like on your hands. So just a little bit about Caritas. We scaled, obviously, when we realized how big all of this was going to be. Today we have about 45 local Caritas organizations. Those are organizations that have kind of the administrative capacity to handle ongoing projects and to absorb funding and do all the reporting that's needed for it to be transparent. In addition, we have about 1,000 parishes that can join in as volunteers, and we work with about 600 romadas. It's the local self-government, so like a local city government that we would be working with, or a local town government, to try and help to facilitate assistance and resilience and all those things. Caritas has been working in Ukraine for 30 years as a network. We did social aid programs, and then in 2014, as I mentioned, we made a decision as a community to respond to the humanitarian needs in the East, and that really positioned us to be able to respond later in 2022. I think that was also like this big lesson that I learned as I was leading the organization, was how much every time you see something, you kind of judge what's happening and then you act. It prepares you for that next step of whatever it is that you'll need next. And it was a really powerful experience to see how all the programming that we had done in the lead up was helping us to do this huge response in 2022. Over the last 2 years, as I mentioned, we had a lot of volunteers. About 10,000 volunteers are registered with us. Active at any time is about 1,000. It's also a good way for people to kind of heal, find resilience, and get integrated into their local communities. And we have about 2,000 staff working in the network. I didn't want to go into really, this is a very complicated slide, but I didn't want to go into a lot of pictures and details about what Caritas is doing, but I wanted to kind of present to you this kind of arc that happens in humanitarian response. Yeah, so you always have that first immediate crisis, but the goal of humanitarian response is always to support people while they're in crisis, and then to lead them out and get them back up on their feet, functioning again, stabilized, and then into development. And so the programming that we have, it goes from humanitarian response into stabilization help, and then into development things. I just want to point out a few. So you see in the humanitarian response, you have kind of these basic needs. There's food, non-food items. So things like, I have it again down at the bottom: bedding, kitchen supplies, clothing, temporary shelter, water, anything that you could imagine, if somebody is fleeing something, whether it be war or some kind of natural disaster, they have these basic needs that need to be taken care of. There's psychosocial support. You always have in the beginning these child-friendly spaces, but they don't go too deep in the beginning because people are transient and you can't start working deeply with people until they've settled down. Also emergency home repair kits. So putting up, if people's homes get damaged, like the windows or the doors or roofs, so giving them basic supplies that they can just quickly close it up and try and close the heating perimeter of the house. Then you move into stabilization, and there you can go deeper. Yeah, there's crisis centers, you do case management, you're helping people to work through all their issues that they have. A lot of work with the children, there's education catch-up programs, child-friendly spaces that are going deeper. And then we do this really cool program, psychosocial support in schools, where we're helping both teachers, parents, and students to stabilize and to process the trauma and learn to kind of work through issues together. We also do repair of homes, access to water, there's cash assistance. I want to mention the livelihood programs because they're really interesting. So we do things that help very small businesses, micro businesses to start up. And we also try and help people to get jobs in the new location where they've arrived, either through working for the local community, so doing community service work that we pay for, or even better is if they get a job working in a business. And then usually there's a good retention rate, and helping people to restore their livelihoods is a big piece of helping people to get back on their feet. And then, of course, there's the kind of collective trauma healing, working with grieving families and work with veterans and their families. And that's all that piece. It's a big piece of stabilization. And some of those pieces will be kind of shifting also into development, where we have like here under development, you see we have our traditional programs that we've always worked on. I'm not going to go over them. It's mostly work with the elderly, work with children, work with people with special needs, and different kinds of programs like awareness, education, prevention of human trafficking. So that's just a quick overview of kind of the wide breadth of programs that Caritas has. And I think the one kind of cross-cutting issue that comes through all of this is this desire to see the fullness, the whole human person, in their complexity and in their, and to offer complex assistance, comprehensive assistance, so that people don't just come in and get one little piece, but that they come in and they're seen as a whole person, and that they get what they need to get back up on their feet and integrated. Here I mentioned a little bit about the volunteers. So interesting is about 50% are young people. And they do all kinds of assistance. They can assist with distribution, with sorting humanitarian aid, working with children, or also working with the elderly, or any kind of assistance at events. And it's really great. This volunteer program, we developed it right before the full-scale invasion, and we were ready to launch it, which was really good timing for us in 2022. So here you see some of the young volunteers working, helping with different things. Whoops, hold on, I'm going to go back here. So I wanted to just show you a couple of pictures, and I'll wrap up in a minute, of some volunteers. So this is mostly people who were displaced, who fled, came to us initially for assistance, and then they come back and they want to volunteer and then help others. So Irina, for example, she was born in Donetsk. She was displaced for the first time in 2014. As you saw on the map, most people stay close. They don't go too far. So she displaced just a little bit further into the country, where she stayed until in the general region until 2022. And then they ended up under occupation for some time. And then that was too stressful for them. And so they actually fled. And they made their way to Kyiv, where, it was for people who were multiply displaced, they've lost their homes, they've rebuilt their lives, and then they lose their homes again. It's just a really deep kind of suffering. But, that's the piece that I think where Caritas has something to offer. They're able to come in, meet the team. There's people greeting them. There's people who are with huge compassion and empathy, listening to their stories. They're offering them that initial assistance that helps them get up on their feet, and then they turn around and they come back. I had this one woman I remember in Chernihiv early on in the full-scale invasion, who told me, she said she was displaced also twice, also from Donetsk, but in a different region. And she told me that every time that I helped somebody, my heart that felt like it was completely broken apart, a piece of my heart gets sewn back together, and I feel like I'm made new. Yeah, it was a really powerful witness, and I hear this all the time in many of our centers. This is of another volunteer. She's in the Ternopil center, Lila Kashuba. Same story of finding hope and resilience by coming back and coming into community, and then helping other people, being active and joining a mission. This is another young mother with a daughter from Skadovsk. It's from the Kherson region, kind of the same story. I think I'm not going to read that to you. And then in the end, so I want to come back to this sense of solidarity. This is the head of our church, His Beatitude Sviatoslav, our patriarch. And I had a conversation with him in February of 2023, and he was reflecting on, kind of this amazing, like on the one hand, we have this crisis going on, we're being attacked on a daily basis. There's people dying, but the humanitarian crisis didn't become a catastrophe, and it didn't become a catastrophe because there was all these people from all over the world, like everybody was contributing some piece, and we were able to avert this huge humanitarian catastrophe. Yeah, while people are still dying from the war itself, but no one died of hunger or cold. And for us, that was a huge gift and a huge thanks to everyone who's been involved in the response. So that's it for my presentation. I think I stayed within the time that you gave me. And then I'm happy to take any questions or. Mhm.
Thank you so much. And I find myself particularly struck by the way in which the community is healing within itself, in terms of people who are displaced, who in this moment are the ones in need of an emergency response. And then when things stabilize a little bit for them, they're coming and they're helping the next group. I was privileged to hear you give a presentation this summer, and I am still struck by a story you told of a group of women that almost had to be forced to retreat back.
Yeah, from Berislav. Yeah.
Because they were so committed to their neighbors, right? Committed to staying with those on the margins. And I think it really is a remarkable thing to be in the midst of this level of conflict and ongoing war and be able to say that people aren't dying of hunger and they're not dying of the cold. As is our custom, we have two students, both of whom are part of our CRS Student Ambassador program, Sairis and Callie, who are going to start off asking you a couple questions for discussion. And I want to say to the others who are on watching, if you have a question, please put it in the chat. And if we have time, we will get to it. I'm going to ask that when they ask their question, they say who's who. But Sairis is a fourth-year undergrad Afro-Latino student who's majoring in illustration. She wants to become an influential artist director within the entertainment industry and has a passion for social justice and a particular interest in the rights relating to women and persons of color. And Callie is a fourth-year psychology major who hopes to go to medical school. She wants to be a neurologist specializing in pediatric oncology. We have very serious students here at St. John's who really do want to make the world a better place. She has a passion for social justice and helping remove the stigma surrounding mental illness in particular. And so I'm going to turn it over to them to engage Tetiana in a conversation.
Hey, thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm Callie, and one of the questions that I had was, with all the help that's being provided, what more do you want to see? What are some other helpful things that you wish to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think one of the pieces, if you've ever encountered anybody who's experienced assault or any kind of violence, a really important piece is the acknowledgement of what's happening, yeah, and to not be, in a way, it's not even forgotten, but to be seen, yeah, and to be seen that it needs to be said that this is what's happening, yeah, and I think that's one piece of it. I would add also the importance of prayer, because I mean, I remember in the beginning, in the first couple of months when like we had no idea what was going to happen, and it was all so crazy, and I remember thinking, how is it that we're still functioning? Like I couldn't understand how we were all keeping it together. It was really, I don't know, it was almost like a miracle to me. And I remember we had this reflection. We were thinking that it was, the prayers of people who were praying for us. Yeah, and the power that has, that it's this, that importance of solidarity, to be seen, to be held in prayer. And there is still the amount of assistance that's coming to Ukraine is declining. So there is still a need for for ongoing support. There's a big, right now, there's a gap happening between, so for humanitarian aid, it's really that emergency kind of aid. And then you have like sustaining aid, and then you have this gap in between. And that gap in between is usually called early recovery or something like that. And very often, when you have a huge emergency the size that you have in Ukraine and it affects the whole country, I mean, you have people in need everywhere, but the money tends to migrate more towards the eastern part, because that's where the front line is, and that's where the bombing is happening. That's where things are being destroyed, and it's more intense there. But there's needs throughout the country, and it's this gap area that's starting to be a challenge. Yeah, and so the gap area, and then this understanding of that the needs are going to be with us for a long time. And if you think about any country, yeah, that if you suddenly went from having, I don't know, 500,000 people in need to 5 million, that's a huge weight, on a system where the economy is being undermined by the war. And how do you support, how do you offer the support to people that they need? Yeah, so I would say that there's a need for kind of, I would say all three. Yeah, one is kind of an advocacy or a recognition. The second would be prayer, and the third would be there's still need for kind of material and aid. Yeah.
Actually, building off of that, for those of us that don't live in Ukraine but are more sitting from the outside, how would you recommend that we provide our support from being here? What methods do you recommend us aiding and supporting the community?
Mm-hmm. You mean the community here in Ukraine, or?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I'm actually very interested in if there would be any interest in kind of making connections between students in the United States and students in Ukraine. That might be an interesting thing to keep a connection between people. And then, the other thing would be to, work through an organization that's providing support to those who are working in the field in Ukraine. So it could be Caritas, it could be, by the way, we have really good cooperation with Sairis. They've been really outstanding, accompanying us from the very beginning. Yeah, so I think there's opportunities. Also, just being aware, a lot of things don't always come on the front page anymore, or they're not so much in the news. In Ukraine, when I follow the news, it seems to me like they've moved into this looking at the war as just like chess pieces, yeah, of how the war itself is going, and they're losing sight of kind of that moral outrage that people had in the beginning. They were like, what? How could this be happening? This doesn't fit, or and this understanding of what people are living. And I think in Ukraine, you have a lot of people have always talked about how Ukrainians are so resilient. They're holding on to that resilience because that's what gives them strength. Yeah, but they're holding on. Yeah, and there does need to be support kind of provided, that maybe through an exchange or something along those lines. I think that would be a good way of engaging.
Sure. What differentiates Caritas from the other various organizations that are also working in Ukraine?
Yeah, so there's actually a lot of, there's like UN organizations here, and there's other like INGOs, international NGOs that are working in Ukraine. I think the thing that makes Caritas different is because we're a community. It's kind of what I was talking about in the beginning. It's both community, it's the way that we do assistance, because we're, Caritas has this thing about, you work, you move from the heart, but you use your mind, and you use your wisdom on how to do that aid. So you're moved into the mission, but you think through and you think about, how do I do this in the best way possible? Yeah, how do I really, what is it that's really going to help this person? And there's like there's a level of empathy. Like when I visit our local centers, I hear this again all the time, that you have different cases coming in, people to register. Yeah. So you might have somebody who, just left and they're okay and they just need a place to stay and need a couple of the basic needs. But then you'll have more difficult cases, where somebody who's lived through some huge difficulty or traumatized, maybe they lived under occupation, maybe there was some other traumatic event that happened to them, and there's this process that happens when they come, to a Caritas center, that people listen, that there's this, again, there's this embrace that happens. Like I remember the staff telling me, sometimes if there's a really hard case that comes in, the person starts crying. And then if it's really bad, then the caseworker starts crying. Then the whole staff might start crying. But there's something healing in that. There's a healing thing. And it's that piece that I was telling you about in the beginning, this importance of kind of recognizing, saying what's really happening, and then standing with that person together in what they're living. Yeah, that's really... I think that's the first step in healing. Yeah, of course, you still need all the other pieces. You still need psychologists, and you need, to help with the material things and whatever else you might need. But that first step, I think, is like this moment of healing, and Caritas naturally does that. We don't have to try. We don't have to, because it's part of our mission. To help people in need, and we do social services, and we've been developing this muscle of kind of kindness and empathy and community for a long time. And I think of all the things, I think that's probably the piece that differentiates us a little bit, from other organizations.
So I was actually going to ask, because I know that dealing in hard times of war can be very demoralizing for a lot of people in a lot of communities that are suffering from it. And so I was actually going to ask, like, how do you guys maintain that level of morality to like persevere through it? Like persevere through the war, through everything, to still like provide for the community and still get the community back and be like, yes, there's like a problem, but like we're going to heal and we're going to recover.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think you started touching on what the answer is in your question, even. Yeah, because you said gather together. Yeah. When it first started, I mean, I remember I was so worried that we would, because we were scaling really big, and I thought, oh, I don't want us to lose our identity. And I started visiting all the local centers, and I have to tell you, by like the second visit, I was like, I don't need to check, because the identity is fully intact. And in fact, I kind of inspire from them and from what there's like this, it's this pulse that happens when you're helping other people. There's something that's so fulfilling and so human, and so much of what we were made for, that it restores you in a powerful way. I mean, of course, you have to be careful not to burn out. You need to take breaks. You need to, take staff out into the countryside. They need to relax a little bit. You need to have supervision. You need to have, psychologists who are online to help in case, somebody needs to, talk through things. But, I think it's being together, two, looking at the reality. I remember, we had I think it started getting a lot harder at the end of last year, when things were stuck for so long, and yet the war, like the brutality of the war, was continuing. And I remember I went to a conference, and that was one of the things that one of the women who was speaking said. She said, the first step in resilience is looking at reality and then responding to it. So you have to look at what's happening, and then you react. Yeah. And that somehow, by acting and by doing it together, that, I don't know, somehow it builds you. Like, I even remember, when the Kakhovka Dam, I don't know if you remember, but in 2023, in June, the Russians hit this dam, and then it had this huge flood. So it, besides destroying the entire water table of, like 3 oblasts, and affecting, I mean, hundreds of thousands, if not 1 million people, with their access to water, they also destroyed the power in the area. And I remember when because nobody thought that they would do it. Because, I mean, everybody, it was always a possibility, but everybody was like, no, they're not going to do it, because they had all these reasons why we thought that they weren't going to do it. And I remember I woke up that morning thinking, it was too much for me. And I just sat there for a minute. And then I thought, okay, I called a meeting. We all got together. we started talking about what we could do, and somehow it, like, by acting, it gives you, it like recharges you. That's one piece. So it's like this hope that is built in action, by acting, by doing something. The other thing for me personally is Sunday liturgy. I go, honestly, I don't, I mean, yeah, every Sunday I feel like I'm rebuilt inside somehow by going to liturgy and communion and going to confession. It's been a very powerful experience for me. Yeah. Kind of plugging.
I wanted to ask you to make sure we got to two things. And one is if you could say a little bit, when we were getting ready to start the webinar, one of the things you noted is that you might have to, hopefully you wouldn't have to move for air raid sirens. So if you could just say a little bit about kind of the daily reality that you and everyone are still living through. And then the second is if you could share a little bit about how your journey to get to where you are. You're now, right, you're running a Caritas Ukraine, but as we do these programs and we have students see people who are working in social justice in so many different ways, if you could just note a little bit about kind of how you got there and what any advice you would have to anyone who wants to maybe work in social justice and development, and may even want to work in the humanitarian space.
Sure. Yeah, really briefly about the air raid sirens. So, and the attacks, I mean, you know, they're happening at night, in the middle of the night, so your sleep is disrupted constantly. And then you have a 2-wall rule or a shelter. So if you don't have a shelter, you usually try and go behind 2 walls, because if there's an explosion nearby, it'll blow the windows out, and that can be very dangerous. So there's this constant, so usually when the air raid siren goes off, you get online and you try and check and see what is it that's happening. Is it just that the bombers have taken off somewhere far into Russia, or are there drones already coming in, or have missiles been fired already? And usually there's usually a notification of what's happening. And then you act, in an appropriate manner. Yeah, it's according to it. But I mean, it's exhausting. I mean, I can tell you it's exhausting. And I was actually, I was finishing my vacation in Lviv when I don't know if you heard of the two ballistic missiles that hit 2 residential areas. So one of the, so they hit 2 residential areas in a city in the western part of the country. And I was 100 meters from one of the ballistic missiles where it struck. It was really, I haven't been that shaken in a long time. Yeah, and then you have to take the time to process it. Yeah, and so you have people who are working, who are processing through, even the constant air raid sirens, is traumatizing. And then of course when you hear explosions, it's worse. Yeah, that's also unnerving. How you work through that. Then I don't know if I answered your question. Yeah, but then in terms of how I got here, I feel like, at least in my life, it's always been an invitation. I feel like I've had an invitation from God and I've responded to it. And every invitation you get, and when you take a step, it prepares you, and it takes you to the next step. Yeah. And I think it's one of the most noble professions to have. I mean, humanitarian aid is such a beautiful, mission to be involved in. Yeah, that this kind of, and even development work, humanitarian aid, all of it put together, yeah, is such a powerful experience of, again, it's the piece that I was talking about before, this restoring of what it means to be human. It fills you in a way that I don't think I that you discover it when you do it. Yeah, it's hard to explain. And then once you do it, it's hard to, then you don't want to turn away. Like I remember, I'll just tell you the story about this staff that we had again in Shid. You'd see there when I first arrived in Ukraine, it was our the smallest Caritas. They were the newest ones, and they had started all from, it was a Bible study. They used to have a Bible study group, and then they had floods going on in the area, like in 2020, I think. And our team came in to try and help them organize the response to the flooding. And then I remember when these women were telling me, they were like, it was the most amazing experience to go and give somebody what they really need at that moment of really deep need. That there was something like, you're helping this other person, but at the same time, somehow you're healing something in yourself. I don't know how to explain it, that it was such a powerful experience. A lot of them were professionals. A lot of them either left their jobs immediately and came to work for Caritas, or some of them were doing like half and half work, because there's something that happens when you fulfill that, that deep vocation to help neighbor. Yeah, that is somehow edifying and fulfilling. Yeah. So I would really encourage people. It's a beautiful, noble mission. And there's a lot of, again, I think the humanitarian community has spent a lot of time thinking about how to do it in the best way. That there's, and it has a logic and a, it's both the heart and the head. Yeah. So you're using both to find your way through. So.
Thank you. What did either of you ladies have one final question that you wanted to ask?
I don't personally have one. She covered the whole board.
I am so grateful, Tetiana, for your giving us your time. I think that it is remarkable, and it is praise. Like we should notice it and celebrate the hope that everything that I have read and seen really does undergird the resilience and the resistance of the Ukrainian people. I mean, there is this just a deep sense of caring for each other and simply a refusal to, they may be holding on to it for dear life, but there is, by sheer will and maybe a lot of prayer, a refusal to give up. And again, where other parts of the world are now talking about it very much like it's a chessboard. And I find myself frequently saying, well, Ukraine isn't just a piece being moved around in wider, this isn't simply a situation where you can talk about proxies. This is a deeply there's a deep history there between Ukraine and Russia and the situation that the people are in. And so I'm very grateful for your time with us today. Thank you to everybody who logged on. Thank you to our wonderful students. And I hope that everyone will join us, and we'll share when this is up on YouTube. And everyone have a nice afternoon.
Yeah, thanks everyone and thank you, Meghan, for the invitation to speak with you. I'm always happy to do that. So
thank you so much. This was lovely. Have a wonderful day.
Yeah, you too.